Okay, so good afternoon again. Today, as you can see, we have a very exciting presentation. And it's great to see many of you here with us. The topic for today's webinar is on, as you have already seen, on fake news. But before we start with presenting the topic, I would like to take some time to introduce you to this online community that we have set up for you that is called Information, Digital and Media Literacy. It's an online network that is free to join, and it's available via the One Education broader network, and it is an online area for educators who share a passion for learning and teaching in higher education. So in our own open online network mindsets, we aim to engage educators, librarians, learning and teaching support professionals, as well as policymakers in critical discussions, as well as creative collaboration that relates to students' lifelong development of information, digital and media literacy. So if you haven't joined yet, please do. We are looking forward to hear your voice, your ideas, whether you have encountered any issues or opportunities in terms of creating partnerships for students' enhancement of information, digital or media literacy within higher education, but also beyond. So at the moment, we're in addition to the webinars, an idea of setting up a mentors and mentees program. So we very much looking forward to some ideas from the community itself. Okay, so with that little introduction, today we have a very interesting topic on citizens' approaches to evaluating political facts in the fake news era. And as you know very well, presented by our own Professor Marcella here at the Robert Gordon University, and also Dr. Graeme Baxter. And the topic is really on all the issues that we have experienced lately regarding what we call the post-truth politics or fake news, alternative facts online. And a lot of that has been focusing on the issue of Brexit or, for example, Donald Trump's election campaign and presidency. So this webinar will reflect upon recent research into fact response, fact checking, and the journey of the political fact. The research that is presented here has been conducted earlier. It was done in 2017, actually consisted of 2 interrelated studies, an online survey of the general public, and a series of 23 electronically assisted interviews with citizens here in the northeast of Scotland. So our presenters are ready. They are waiting behind me. As you know, our fantastic presenters, Professor Rita Marcella, has over 30 years of experience as a researcher and academic in information library science, and is a professor of information management at the Robert Gordon University. Her current areas of research fall within these areas, particularly information-seeking behavior within political and business-related text. And also we have Dr. Graeme Baxter, who is a research fellow within the same school, the School of Creative and Cultural Business, here at Robert Gordon University. And his research has addressed the provision and use of government, parliamentary and citizenship information. He has looked into the freedom of information legislation, the provision of information during government public consultation exercises, and many more topics. So both of these presenters have a keen interest in fake news and the credibility of information that is particularly provided by political actors. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to our 2 presenters, and we're now ready to start. And first, I would like to invite it's Dr. Graeme Baxter first, so who is just behind me, ready to start a kick off this presentation for you. So thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. Well, hopefully you can see me, and thanks very much for joining the session this afternoon. Yeah, as Dina said, Rita and I, we've really been conducting research into the use of the internet by political parties and individual politicians across Scotland for over 15 years now. Very much from an information science rather than a political science perspective. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk about some research that was conducted relatively recently, which explored the ways in which Scottish citizens evaluate the credibility of information provided online by political actors in Scotland. And of course, this has been at the time, again, as Dina said, when terms such as post-truth politics and alternative facts and fake news have become common parlance. And of course, as this slide demonstrates, much of the discourse has been around Brexit. So with Boris and the Brexit bust there, plus Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, and of course his subsequent presidency, where the term fake news has really come to the fore. But concerns about the credibility of online information are actually nothing new. In fact, in the very earliest days of the web, back in 1996, Tim Berners-Lee he envisaged the use of what he called an "oh yeah" button that users could click to sort of obtain the provenance of a piece of information. And in those early days, there were quite a few commentators suggested that the criteria that have traditionally been used in the evaluation of printed reference works in the library and information sciences, such as authority and accuracy, objectivity, currency, and coverage, they could be applied equally to online sources. But I think it's fair to say at the same time, others argued that these types of a checklist type approach were a wee bit too mechanistic and were at odds with critical thinking. So as a result, as a body of work emerged over the next few years that did focus on the cognitive aspects of evaluating credibility. And I think it's fair to say that in the library and information sciences, there are 6 theories that are probably the most prominent here. And I've just listed them on this slide here. I don't really have time to go into too much detail. So we'd Fritsch and Cromwell, who drew on cognitive authority, Wathen and Burkle, who regarded the evaluation of online credibility as an iterative process. We'd Fogg with his prominence interpretation theory, Metzger's dual processing model, Sundar's main model, which stands for the modality, agency, interactivity, and navigability. And finally, there are Hillergos and Rita, who created this unifying framework of credibility assessment. More recently, there have been some suggestions, most prominently by the psychologist Stefan Lewandowski, that suggest that we should maybe combine these cognitive solutions with automated techniques of what he calls techno-cognition. So there's quite a few things going on at the moment. Anyway, to our own research, which was conducted actually during the 2017 UK general election. Now, when we started off this piece of research, it was actually just due to tie in with local government elections here in Scotland. But then right bang in the middle of our research, Theresa May announced the snap general election. And so as a result, we kept the research open for quite a bit longer, and we think it attracted a bit more interest than it possibly would have otherwise. It consisted of 2 main elements. There was an anonymous survey that we created and disseminated via SurveyMonkey. And as you'll see from the slide there, we had 538 responses. plus we had 23 more in-depth interviews with citizens in a town called West Hill in Aberdeenshire. And I think over the years, it's fair to say that Rita and I, we've tried to conduct our research as close as possible to the everyday lives of our subjects. So these interviews took place with people as they effectively went about their daily lives in two public locations. There was the cafe in West Hill Community Church's premises there. That's the first photo on the slide there, and also in the public library in West Hill. Now, the online survey was based effectively on us presenting 5 real-life social media posts made by the 5 main political parties in Scotland. These are the 5 parties who currently have elected representatives in the Scottish Parliament. And each one of these posts contain various facts and figures and statistics on key issues in Scotland. Now, we chose these 5 posts deliberately because none of them gave any indication as to the sources of the various facts and figures. So we hypothesised that our respondents would really have to give some real thought as to their likely credibility. So the 5 posts are on the left of the slide here. I don't know how easy it is to see these, but the first one, top left, was from the Scottish National Party, the SNP, who some of you may know have now been in government in Scotland since 2007. And their social media posts tend to defend their record in government. And this was the case with the first post here, which was talking about their record of a record proportion of school leavers going on to what they called a positive initial destination. So that was the first image. The second one was from the Scottish Conservatives, who are now the official opposition in the Scottish Parliament to the SNP government. And not surprisingly, it was attacking the SNP's record in government. With this particular post, it was on the number of college places that were available throughout Scotland. So that was the second image. The third one was from Scottish Labour and also attacked the SNP's record, this time on oil and gas revenues, which some of you may be aware formed a major part of the economic argument for an independent Scotland during the 2014 independence referendum, but which later had to be revisited when there was a massive downturn in the North Sea oil and gas industry. So that particular post relates to that situation. The fourth one was from the Scottish Green Party, who you may be aware are pro-independence allies of the SNP. And their post was actually more of a veiled attack on the Scottish Government, this time on the high childcare costs in Scotland. And then the fifth and final post was from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, again also attacking the SNP government's record, this time in schools. So the post included various facts and figures on class sizes, teacher numbers, the number of pages of guidance that teachers have to read, and so on. So those were the 5 images. Now the bar chart on this slide shows the proportions of our sample who felt that the facts and the figures within the 5 posts were either quite or very reliable. So as you can maybe see there, the Green Party's post was regarded as the most reliable, with 47% of our sample describing it as quite or very reliable, closely followed by the SNP on 45%, and then bringing up the rear there, 25.3% regarded the Scottish Conservatives post as reliable. And it's probably worthwhile saying that the order was reversed exactly when the the data was analysed in terms of the proportion who felt the information would be very or quite unreliable. So the Conservatives were regarded as the least reliable, and the Greens as the least unreliable, if that's making sense. But across the board, none of the images were regarded as reliable by a majority of our respondents. So you can see that our sample was a largely sceptical one. Now, our survey then asked open questions about the reasons for their responses, why they felt that the information in these posts would be either reliable or unreliable. And this table attempts to summarise the main responses. I don't really have time to go through these in any great detail, but you'll see there were those who talked about trust or mistrust in a specific party. Again, SNP and the Greens rated best there. They were regarded as the most trustworthy. In terms of mistrust, the Conservatives rated the worst there. 14.7% regarded them as untrustworthy. Some people spoke about just a general mistrust in politicians and parties across the board. There were those who spoke about a mistrust of negative attack politics, which does appear in quite a few of the social media posts, particularly amongst the opposition parties. There were significant numbers spoke about the likely presence of bias or spin in the posts, and also significant numbers, roughly a third for each post, talked about a lack of detail or definitions or any kind of context for the information that was being presented in the posts. And large numbers also did highlight the fact that no sources were provided for the facts and figures included in the 5 posts. Small numbers spoke about their own professional or personal experience being a factor in their credibility judgments. For example, those respondents who maybe had a young family felt better qualified to talk about the childcare costs that the Green Party's post had discussed. And finally there, quite a few respondents spoke about what was effectively just a gut feeling, that they just felt that the figures looked reasonable or credible. So the next set of questions in the survey then asked about where our respondents might go to actually obtain information that would help them either confirm or debunk the information that had been provided in the 5 social media posts. Again, don't really have time to go through these in any great detail, but there's maybe one or two things that we should emphasise. I think firstly and importantly, only small proportion of the sample were actually willing to admit that they wouldn't know how to go about looking for information or further information. So the majority did seem relatively confident that they could find out more about these particular topics. Having said that, many of them were decidedly vague about their likely search strategies, simply saying that they would do their own research, or they would do their own search, they would do their own online search. Some, unsurprisingly, specified Google would be a starting point, but generally speaking, they were very vague about how they would go about their searches. So some people said they would follow links on the social media posts, which, having done this, would have proved quite unfruitful, because really it just took you back to the main page of 2 of the parties who provided URLs on their social media posts. So that would have been a bit of a waste of time. Some said they would consult the political parties' websites or their social media sites. Some said they would take a more kind of proactive approach, requesting information directly from the party or from their local MP or MSP. Some said they would consult government websites, government departmental websites, or government agency websites. Some said they would go about making freedom of information requests. Universities and think tanks got a mention, did NGOs and charities and third sector organisations. The news media proved popular with some respondents, and also family, friends and colleagues, particularly if it was felt that they had a subject-specific knowledge. So, for example, the post about the schools and the number of teachers and pupil-teacher ratios and so on, if they had family and friends that worked in the education sector, then they would consult them. So most of them were confident, but is this confidence misplaced? Well, I think possibly a yes, because seeing these various responses got us actually thinking about the original sources of the facts and figures that appeared on the posts. So we set about trying to find these ourselves. And as we'll see from the next slide, we were ultimately successful. So all of the figures did have their origins in some publicly accessible data of some form. Although I think we would have to say that in some cases it became clear that the parties had been a bit disingenuous in their interpretation of the original data. And it's also worthwhile mentioning that in most of the cases it took a lot of patience and perseverance and fairly advanced and sophisticated search techniques to find the original sources. And I think it's something that we're unconvinced about, that the public at large would have the time, the ability, or indeed the inclination to actually go about these searches themselves, which I think puts even more of an onus on these political actors to cite their original sources. Okay, this process also got us thinking about the journey of a political fact. How does a fact transform itself from the original data source into a widely cited fact by politicians and the news media? And we've attempted to demonstrate the journey of the political fact in this slide here. So the journey would start over on the far left there. It may start with a Scottish Government department, a Scottish Parliament committee, a university or a think tank, or perhaps a charity or a third sector group. They may broadcast this fact through a report or a paper or a press release of some kind. Although, as this diagram also tries to demonstrate, sometimes these facts are effectively forced out of public bodies through freedom of information requests. So the fact may then be picked up by the news media or by other political actors, such as politicians and parties, who may then broadcast it through their own website or social media account, or through a speech or a press release of some kind. But it's more likely to be picked up by the news media, who will run with it in a story, and then the fact will then be picked up by a wider audience, including other news media, other political actors, and they'll then run with it themselves. And this process just gets repeated again and again, really depending on how interesting and how topical the particular topic is that the facts related to. Occasionally, as we've tried to demonstrate in the figure here as well, the fact may be challenged by the media, by a fact-checking agency, and subsequently corrected. Although there is certainly some recent research, including by Lewandowski that I mentioned earlier, that suggests that these corrections have very little impact on the recipients. So anyway, as you can see from the bottom of the diagram here, as the journey progresses, the original source of the fact becomes less and less clear, and the fact itself is increasingly likely to be reinterpreted to suit the needs and the political agenda of whoever's using it. Okay, I think we're about to take a very brief intermission while I hand over the reins to Rita. So I shall just switch off the camera very briefly. Thank you.
So ready to go. Oops. Hello everybody, and I hope you can hear me. I'm just adjusting my microphone and things. So I'm Rita Marcella, and it's lovely to have a chance to talk to you all today about this piece of research. Graeme's spoken about the survey. I'm going to talk a little bit about the interviews that we conducted as the kind of second stage of the research. The survey obviously gave us quite interesting data, quite a lot of interesting data about how people describe or report their behaviour in the context of information behaviour in relation to facts and in a political context. But it is fair to say that it's always been our view that actually you need a more in-depth understanding of how people actually behave rather than how they report they would behave in an ideal world. And Graeme's alluded to the fact that we were unconvinced by some of the statements perhaps that people would check X and Y and Z. So anyway, alongside the survey and while it was running, we undertook these interviews, and the interviews enabled us to sit with people as they looked online at some web pages which we had uploaded, made available for them, to choose which pages to look at and to interact with those pages, alongside which we had a semi-structured interview where we would ask questions around what they were looking at, what they understood from it, how they rated it in terms of credibility, authority, etc., how they would check. And we asked them to actually go through the process of demonstrating how they might, in some instances, actually check. So the interviews then were an open opportunity with 23 individuals, and this slide actually just shows you a list of some of the pages that the interviewees selected to look at, and they had a choice across parties and a choice across policy areas, and you can see that there was quite a high level of interest in schools and education, health, some of the stuff that you would perhaps expect. People looked at SNP material, but they also looked at the Conservatives, Labour, etc. And as they sat and looked at these pages, we would probe and prompt them to actually talk about what they're seeing in a kind of think aloud manner. So get them to articulate how they responded, what they thought of facts that were embedded in the pages, etc. So some of the key findings of the interviews, and we actually had quite a lot of data from these 23 interviews, and again, as with the survey, I can only really summarise some of the most significant aspects perhaps of it, but here are some of those key findings. And Graeme talked earlier about the theory, the models that have been developed in terms of checking credibility of information behaviour and so on. And it's fair to say that from our study, from our research, the participants didn't really behave in the ways that models might suggest they could or should behave, and therefore there was little relation to existing theory, with the possible exception of Fogg's PI theory. And Fogg's PI theory is the theory of the prominence and interpretation, which basically argues that unless people are attracted to information and go through the process of seeking to understand and interpret it, that is how people go about the process of interacting with information. And I guess if you think about your own behaviour, as we all do it, as we all encounter information in any context, but in a political context, there's only certain things that we notice in the first place and that we bother to then ask us what it means, what the significance of that information actually is. So an awful lot of the stuff that goes on is beneath the parapet, as it were, of people's notice. Typically, from our observations, people judged the facts that were presented to them very swiftly, extraordinarily swiftly in most respects, and largely intuitively, and typically would make a swift judgment as to whether it was reliable or unreliable, factual or incorrect, almost instantaneously. They were influenced by their previous knowledge of a subject, and that might actually just influence the way they thought about the subject and the extent to which they knew that some simple statistics, perhaps in an educational context, might be misleading. So previous knowledge of a particular subject through professional work in practice or education, their own education, might make them more inclined to question particular types of information and facts. Interestingly, and I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say this before, but people tended to notice more and respond more to facts that they disagreed with, or those that were very extreme in either painting a really positive or a very negative picture. And I guess the extreme facts are less surprising, because that is the kind of whole headline thing, isn't it? If it's not something extraordinary, people aren't going to pay attention. But actually, the extent to which they notice things that they disagreed with is I think, interesting. And most people, we asked them to, after they'd looked at some of this material and interacted with it, we asked them to measure their own capacity to evaluate facts, because this is one of the things that I think probably interests us as much as anything. And in the context of information literacy, media literacy, etc., it's really important that people are able to assess honestly, realistically, that they're able to tell whether or not they can evaluate the facts that they're presented with. I mean, the first step, I think, in tackling fake news and misinformation has to be people realizing that they might not know whether a fact's correct or not. And, that's a kind of primary, I think, component of looking to improve the situation, improve situations in the future. However, it is fair to say that from our observations and our research, one can only describe quite a number of our participants as delusionally confident, displaying a level of confidence that was not actually supported by what we watched them do. So we, in looking at what we learned from the research, we started to think about developing a fact interrogation model, i.e. a model of in what circumstances will the public, will citizens actually seek to question, query, challenge, interrogate a fact with which they're presented. What is necessary? What are the factors that will make them check a fact, that will make them go to see if they can verify a piece of information with which they're presented? And this slide kind of sets out both the influential factors but also the kind of process through which people could be observed to go. And obviously, whether or not people will check a fact, do check a fact, is influenced by a lot of things. And as Graeme said earlier, it's not necessarily our belief from the survey that people would or did check facts to the extent that they claim to do. But the things that were influential were things like, are people willing to spend the time Do they have the motivation? What's actually going to encourage them to do this? What level of trust do they have in the whole process? Are they, do they have an allegiance politically? Because that will ultimately, from again our observation, influence whether or not a particular participant, a particular citizen does seek to check a fact. If they have an allegiance to a political party, they're much less likely perhaps to actually bother to check the fact. Do they have the subject understanding? Do they have the online skills? Do they have the comprehension levels? Was the fact prominently displayed, or is it kind of hidden in there? Is it relevant? Do they see the relevance? Do they understand what would constitute an authority for this fact? Who could be believed? Where would they find that person? And other aspects like just simply the quality of the presentation. The number of people that spoke about something that's badly presented or that is not grammatically correct being a factor that would make them question a fact was actually quite high. So the kind of elements of the kind of stages that people could go through in whether or not they interrogate a fact, and bear in mind they could stop before point one in this. Do they notice the fact? Do they check the fact against their existing body of subject knowledge? And or do they check the fact against their existing political allegiance? So do they ask themselves, is it credible? Is it, am I believing this because I support the party? And that's an important stage. Is the fact accepted or rejected? What are the criteria? What are the reasons for it being accepted or rejected? And do they actually undertake further interrogation? Now, none of these stages might be present, or all of them, or some of them, and ultimately, though, in order to truly and genuinely evaluate a fact, you have to go through all of them. We would all have to go through all of them. I better hurry, hadn't I? I'm slowing down. This slide shows you an information quality awareness model that we've been developing for a little while now, because we have over the years done a number of these kinds of pieces of research. And it alludes to the fact that there is in participant behaviour and information behaviour, there is this concern, there is this concept of people's awareness that facts might be challenged, might be incorrect, and there's their confidence in their ability to judge the information. Both of these are variables in any given situation. So you or I might encounter a fact on a news broadcast tonight, and we will be to a greater or lesser extent aware that that information might be unreliable, and we will be to a greater or lesser extent confident about our capacity to actually judge the reliability of that information. And it is the case that if people's engagement with that fact doesn't make them question reliability or question their capacity to intuitively judge the information, then further checking won't take place. So that's the significance of the model. And we developed this quadrant whereby people could be placed at various points in the quadrant, where you had people who were aware of the potential unreliability of information, but recognized that their own ability to judge that reliability might be flawed in some way, might be less than's actually required, which is, I would suggest, probably the highest level of misinformation awareness that it's possible to have. Then you get people who are aware that information may be unreliable, but they're very confident in their ability to judge reliability. And that's significant because we found, as Graeme said, that people are sceptical about the information that's presented to them. They are sceptical of facts and statistics and political spin and all of those things. However, typically they're also very confident about or many of them are very confident about their ability to judge that reliability. In the lower half of this, we have people who are unaware that information may be unreliable, but also recognise that they wouldn't be good at assessing information. Typically, people tend not to identify themselves as being part of this group, largely, I suspect, because it's a very ill-informed place in the world to be in, where you're unaware of the unreliability of information. And this is a kind of general observation about how people might self-identify or how we might categorize them. But people can just be very unaware at that level, but not conscious that that's the case. And then you've got the unaware and confident, who are people who don't know that a fact might be challenged, are apt to accept facts, will consume them without critical interaction, interrogation, but also confident that what they're seeing, that they would be able to tell somehow that that's the case. So, moving on, we've also came up with a typology of information searchers in a political information setting. And again, this was to try and describe the variety of people's response that they might demonstrate in interacting with political information, or arguably, I guess, any information. But in our case, we were particularly obviously looking at political information, and came up with these 5 groups. At one end, the indifferent searcher, the individual who has no interest and indeed might even actively avoid political information in the context of, say, an election or whatever it might be. I suspect there are more of these people around than one might expect. That actually, you know, the scepticism, etc., may have led to there being a significant body of citizens in any context that are in that particular group. And these are obviously the people that non-partisan government campaigns are seeking to encourage to interact and engage with politics, etc. So one at the end you have the indifferent searcher. Then you've got the reactive searcher, the people, and again there are large numbers of us who do this, who receive the political information, but don't do so actively, are just exposed to it, and therefore may be very unlikely to actually interrogate the information that they're presented with. They don't have a kind of systematic way of seeking information. They may have no consciousness that they've got information needs. They might not realise that information might be helpful to them. Then we've got what we've described as the haphazard searcher. So people who are out looking for information, want to know something more than they do at present, but really don't have access to much of a variety of sources and don't have any sense of how to put a search together. This, for me, this category was very strongly illustrated in things like the referenda that have been held, the Brexit and independence referenda, where people wanted an answer, but they'd not a clue where they might get an answer, and indeed arguably weren't even very good at formulating the question. The search question, they didn't know how to formulate that. They just knew they wanted an answer. The proactive searcher would be much more systematic in what they do. They have identified particular perhaps policy areas. They understand that there might be differences of view, that there might be multiple sources in different parts of the political spectrum, and they're prepared to go off and try to consult, look at a range of views, take those different views on board, try to assess them, etc. And finally, what we've described as the engaged searcher, so people who go beyond the simply looking for information in a kind of information source type of way, but are actually looking to gather data, almost gathering primary data from people, getting people going out and seeking responses, seeking views, etc., in a very extended way. So it's fair to say that from the sample that we had in this particular research, that most people could be grouped in either the haphazard or the proactive searcher group. So our future research plans, it's an area that, as Graeme said, we've been working on for decades, and we continue to be very interested in. We're having undertaken something of this consideration of the journey of the fact and how a fact comes into existence and how it then becomes, it's intermediated, it becomes part of the object of discussion, etc. And to look at that in more detail. And one of the things that's not really mentioned, we didn't mention that much today in the survey, was we tried to get people to give us examples of facts that they knew were unreliable or that had been contested in some way. And I quite like to do a little bit more of that, more of the looking at the nature of flawed facts, you know, how you might categorize those, etc. And we'd ultimately like either ourselves or encouraging others to do more research, to carry out more studies of citizens' interaction with contested facts. And that brings our presentation to a conclusion and gives us some opportunity, I think, for some questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, both Graeme and Rita. I'm back to my seat here. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience, and I hope that you find it as interesting as I found it, because especially I enjoyed this idea, thinking about this idea that obviously there are differences between the different political parties in how they they check the facts, but also this delusional sense that people have that they can actually check the facts even when they have a bias towards a political party. I thought that was very interesting, because we do tend to have maybe a lot of a higher sense of us being in a position to judge the credibility of information and so on. So I would like now to invite the audience to ask any questions to our two presenters. And I can see that Paul is typing and Jenny are typing, so thank you very much. We will finish the recording now. So we are not going to record the questions, but we're here to continue with the questions that you have live to ask our presenters here. So thank you very much for attending the session.